Welcome back to The Gay Science, Book 4 by Friedrich Nietzsche, and we're going to jump in with aphorism number 311. We're getting into the home stretch. I think we'll only have one more episode of Book 4 before we get back into the Nietzsche podcast, Season 6. Very excited for that, but I'm also very excited for many of these final aphorisms, which are some of the most significant in the whole book. But Nietzsche begins, or rather we're beginning this week, with a somewhat difficult aphorism, I think mainly because of the translation. And over the years, I've looked at multiple translations of The Gay Science. We're still sticking with Kaufman's, obviously, but it was very helpful for me to compare and contrast to understand exactly what Nietzsche's saying here, which is actually rather straightforward. But it's just some of the phrasing is a little unusual, but that might just be my opinion. So let's get right into it. Quote, refracted light. One is not always bold, and when one grows tired, then one of us, too, is apt to moan like this. It is so hard to hurt people. Oh, why is it necessary? What does it profit us to live in seclusion when we refuse to keep to ourselves what gives offense? Would it not be more advisable to live in the swarm, and to make up to individuals the sins that should and must be committed against all? To be foolish with fools, vain with the vain, and enthusiastic with the enthusiasts, wouldn't that be fair, given such overweening deviation on the whole? When I hear of the malice of others against me, isn't my first reaction one of satisfaction? Quite right. I seem to be saying to them, I am so ill-attuned to you and have so much truth on my side that you might as well have a good day at my expense whenever you can. Here are my faults and blunders. Here my delusion, my bad taste, my confusion, my tears, my vanity, my owlish seclusion, my contradictions. Here you can laugh. Laugh then and be merry. I do not resent the law and nature of things according to which faults and blunders cause merriment. To be sure, times used to be more beautiful, when anyone with a halfway new idea could still feel so indispensable that he would go out into the street and shout at everyone, Behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I should not miss myself if I were there. All of us are dispensable. But to repeat it, that is not how we think when we are bold. Then we don't think of this. End quote. So almost this entire section is framed, it's placed in quotation marks, as the voice of someone who is speaking at a time when they are lacking in bravery. Kaufman translates it as bold, you could say daring, but really when you lack the courage, right? And Nietzsche specifically says, when one grows tired, then even one of us, so one of these free spirits, one who are among our ranks, even we can end up speaking like this. So this is one of those aphorisms where Nietzsche's not speaking for himself. He's making it clear that this is the voice of, well, a certain state of the soul, a certain impulse, we might say. It's speaking out of a sense of weariness, out of being tired, no longer having the courage for, we might say, the solitude required of the great philosopher. But I think Kaufman's translation is a bit weird because he begins these words of the thinker lacking in boldness, who says it's so hard to hurt people. Why is it necessary? And what he means is it's not saying it's difficult to inflict pain in the sense of being practically difficult. It's difficult for me on the level of my sentiments or my feelings. Why is it necessary for us to have to inflict pain to others? And so then Nietzsche's thought proceeds through all of these sort of it's almost like a free association that he's thinking, what does it profit us to live in seclusion when we refuse to keep to ourselves what gives offense? So I am withdrawing into solitude as physically, and yet I want to publish these books to the world that will give great offense, that will attack all of people's most deeply held beliefs. So wouldn't it be more advisable to live in the swarm? Now think here of the language of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he talks about the flies of the marketplace. Nietzsche often speaks of the throngs of people, the metropolises, a sort of metropolitan existence as a swarm existence. And it's mainly here and in that passage in Zarathustra. Elsewhere throughout this book, he mostly uses the term herd, but swarm is a much different connotation. It still connotes this sort of collective existence, but there's something about the swarm which is almost somehow more negative than the herd, because it's this image of sort of chaotic, flitting about in every direction. It's sort of what we associate with like an infestation or something like that. And so it's very telling that it's like when I'm lacking the bravery to truly maintain my solitude, I say, why not live in the swarm? Why not be a fool with the foolish, enthusiastic with the enthusiasts, and so on and so forth? And so when he says, wouldn't that be fair given such overweening deviation on the whole? This is another translation or a sentence that I think is poorly translated, insofar as what Nietzsche is saying is that there's already so much deviation from the mean that it seems as if we have a surplus of deviance, we might say. And Nietzsche's thought is certainly deviant as it stands in relation to the traditional morality and the conventionally held common sense beliefs. And so isn't it only fair that I should allow all of you to have a good laugh at all of my blunders and faults? There's something about hiding yourself from let's look at the title of the passage, Refracted Light. So light bending back towards itself. And I can't help but think of the Hegelian notion of recognition here. The idea of wanting to be recognized and wanting to recognize others, both of you mutually recognizing each other in your self-consciousness. It's funny because Nietzsche seems to want to mutually, or not Nietzsche, but the impulse that's speaking here, the weary impulse, the impulse lacking in bravery, is saying we ought to all simply mutually recognize our sins, in a sense. Our faults, we might say what is human, all too human in us. And so by living among the swarm, living among people, rather than retreating into seclusion, you allow them to see all of your blunders, your faults, your contradictions, your confusion, your tears, your vanity. And you can laugh at me. And is this not a sort of a compensation for the fact that I have deviated so far from the mean, that I have given so much offense to the morality of the community? Is it not only fair? And we might think of, I often think of this, that we know so much about Nietzsche's life now, and I wonder how much or to what degree he would even think it would be realistic that future generations would have access to so many of his letters and know about all of his personal correspondences and relationships and have all these accounts of what he was like as a person, because he very much tries to craft a certain image of who he was as a person, not just in his writings, the way he communicates and his style of his writings, but even in Ecce Homo, where he attempts to sort of intercede into his own biography and give his own account of who he is from the perspective of his life, his character, and so on and so forth, and to define all of that for us. And it's very interesting the things he does not mention in Ecce Homo. For example, there's no chapter where he talks about the Lou Salome affair in that book. This is all things that we know or don't even know, which have been alleged by people after Nietzsche died and then have sort of gone through the rumor mill over the years. So it's just interesting that Nietzsche has perhaps bared more of his faults, his blunders, his contradictions, his tears than maybe perhaps he would have thought that the world would even have access to. That he lives more closely, the actual nature of who he is as a person is more closely in our minds, or he's in a closer focus in our minds than I think he would have imagined, that he would have probably thought that most people would simply know him through his books. But in any case, this wearying voice says, I do not want to disagree with, or I do not resent the nature of things, that faults and blunders cause merriment. And so there's this sense that sort of living communally with other human beings, actually going and being a part of the collective, part of that way of life, the social life, is giving each other pleasure in perceiving the faults of others. That might sound like a very strange and perverse way of putting it, of the benefit of the social life, but it's just funny that seems indisputably true, that people enjoy this. I mean, that's the whole point of reality television, or a lot of content on social media, of look at how or a lot of threads on Reddit, right, of look at how much worse off this other person has it, or how much worse of a person they are from me. I can feel better about myself. It's a kind of pleasure and joy that we take within that social life, within that mutual recognition that Hegel spoke of. And so there's a real attraction to it. And Nietzsche also says at the end, this last paragraph that's in the quotations, There was a time when someone with even a halfway new idea could feel so indispensable that their idea was so important that they could go declare it to be as though it were descended from heaven, that their new ideas will it's the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And this final word from this wearying voice who's lacking in bravery is, all of us are dispensable. So, it's a sort of delusion on the part of the prophets and the legislators of values that they were, in fact, dispensable. We are all dispensable. And in fact, this last sentiment is somewhat in keeping with Nietzsche's broader philosophy as he's put it forward in The Gay Science, that nature is a squanderer. Nature will waste her best creations without a moment's hesitation. Whatever way of living we determine or we develop, and whatever sort of philosophical justification we create, it all ends up advancing the species in the long run. And of course, Nietzsche concludes that none of this is how we think when we actually have bravery on our side, within us, when we actually have some courage. In other words, there's something nihilistic about this passage, about saying, oh, what does it matter? I might as well go live with the many, go live with the swarm. And, Kaufman includes a very, an interesting letter, an excerpt from a letter to Peter Gast. And Nietzsche writes, quote, "To this day, my whole philosophy totters after an hour's sympathetic conversation with total strangers. It seems so foolish to me to wish to be right at the price of love, and not be able to communicate what one considers most valuable, lest one destroy the sympathy. Hence my tears." End quote. So in other words, what Nietzsche feels to be most valuable, there's many aspects of his philosophy, which again, they are moral critiques, metaphysical critiques, but his ideas can be harsh, they can be disturbing, they can, his attack on pity, his rejection wholeheartedly of the Christian worldview in favor of pagan Greek values, which he says were not humane, but a sort of a morality of the impulses, of the instincts, which allowed for tiger-like cruelty or orgiastic feasts and all of these things. We can imagine that Nietzsche would not perhaps want to bring this up in polite conversation in 19th century Italy or Germany, with meeting with strangers. And that's why he says his whole philosophy totters, because the good feeling of being having a moment's sympathy or a moment's these warm-hearted, nice interactions with other human beings, the nice feelings of community with others, are enough to almost knock Nietzsche's entire philosophy off balance. Now, is this all a sort of damning condemnation of Nietzsche's philosophy, that he himself had these doubts about it? Well, it's interesting. I mean, you could certainly take it that way. That's up to you. What's interesting is that he experiences these feelings and then he classifies it as a lack of courage. He classifies it as, the language he would later use is sort of like a weakening impulse, declining impulses. The fact that you are currently lacking in boldness shows that you're lacking in vigor or vitality. This must be an expression of, ill health or tiredness, weariness, fatigue. Must be at a moment when your will is at a sort of an ebb. And so it's interesting because that is part of Nietzsche's project, is to sort of figure out, Klosowski talks about this a lot, which of his thoughts come from health and which come from sickness. And so Nietzsche has these thoughts that contradict with his main philosophical project, and it's almost as if he says, well, those obviously are sick thoughts, and that is how I will classify them. I'm going to classify them as being voiced by an impulse lacking in boldness. And so that's all rather interesting. Let's move on to 312. Quote, "My dog. I have given a name to my pain and call it dog. It is just as faithful, just as obtrusive and shameless, just as entertaining, just as clever as any other dog, and I can scold it and vent my bad mood on it, as others do with their dogs, servants, and wives." End quote. So there's that famous koan about Zhao Zhu's dog, and I've always thought of this one as like the koan of Nietzsche's dog. What does it mean to say your pain is like your dog? Well, he says it's just as faithful and entertaining and clever as any dog. We might imagine, because of Nietzsche's illness and the perpetual suffering that, or not perpetual, but we might say perpetually recurring suffering that he had to deal with throughout his life, we could say his pain follows him around like a dog, like your dog would follow you around. And it's entertaining, it's clever, right? Just as obtrusive and shameless. So it will butt in at any moment, right? Just as a dog doesn't know when it's the right or appropriate time to, burst into the room and start barking or start licking itself in front of company or something like that. We can just imagine all these things that Nietzsche is sort of personifying, or maybe personifying is the wrong word, caninifying his pain, rendering it into a sort of form of like a character. It's funny that Nietzsche so often likes to do this in his writing. We have the Wanderer and his shadow. We have his character of Zarathustra. He's often writing to the free spirits and philosophers of the future. He's often employing other voices, as we just saw in the previous aphorism, or speaking through a madman. I mean, there's so many characters in this book, Zarathustra, and they all sort of, they don't all necessarily explicate Nietzsche's philosophy so much as, again, different impulses or aspects of him. But it's funny, for as much as Nietzsche is seen as a philosopher lacking in compassion, which certainly there's an argument to be made for that, the implication here is almost that he's able to create this sort of mental construct of his pain. He's able to actually localize the source of the disruptions of his psyche, perhaps the reasons for his bad mood, with, to this particular aspect of him, to his pain, to his dog. And he can vent his bad mood on it. And therefore he doesn't need an actual human being to dispense his ressentiment onto the world, to use them as the canvas to paint his ressentiment onto. He doesn't need a servant or a wife or a literal dog. And so it's somewhat funny, because there's that passage in Genealogy where he's saying the priests of all ages tricked mankind in a way, or the sleight of hand that they performed when their suffering sheep of their congregation would go to the priest, who's their shepherd, and say, "Why do I suffer?" He would say, "Indeed, there's a reason you suffer, my poor suffering sheep, and that reason is you. You suffer because of your own sin," right? So you have this original sin inside of you, and you are the source of all of your problems. And that this is the priest's maneuver of redirecting ressentiment back inwards, so that it's not discharged outwards in the form of action, vindictiveness, or any of these types of things. And this relates to the creation of the bad conscience. I'm not necessarily relating that to this passage, but I'm wondering if this is that Nietzsche had the insight into how that worked, precisely because of his illness once again, because of this perpetual pain inside of him. That in Nietzsche's case, he could actually look at himself, he could look in the mirror and say, you are the cause of your own suffering. If not your conscious choices, your intentions, but there's something inside of you that is to blame for all of your bad moods and your storms and tempests and all of these things. And to the extent that we might actually compare those two passages, he does say, I can vent my bad mood on my own pain, on my dog. So in the sense that, is this not Nietzsche turning his cruelty back inward, right? Cruelty that might have been generated by his own suffering, that some people who do suffer a long time from terminal diseases or just old age, there's the stereotype of the elderly person who, rather than becoming old and kindly, becomes cranky and mean and set in their ways and stubborn and angry. And of course, we could understand why. Aging can be a very painful process for many people. And so it's funny that here, Nietzsche seems to give an example of how you can redirect your cruelty inward so that you don't end up becoming that mean old codger, something like that. The person who takes the frustration and anger at their own pain and turns it outward to the world. And so it's interesting. I think there's many more sort of musings that one could draw upon this passage, but it's very short, and it's very sort of allegorical. It's sort of a little, it's again another personal confession about Nietzsche, rather than a philosophical idea or argument. Let's go to 313. Quote, "No image of torture. I want to proceed as Raphael did, and never paint another image of torture. There are enough sublime things so that one does not have to look for the sublime where it dwells in sisterly association with cruelty, and my ambition also could never find satisfaction if I became a sublime assistant at torture." End quote. And that's certainly what Christianity has done, isn't it? Is to pair the sublime with cruelty in the form of the God on the cross, the holy mystery that's revealed in the crucifixion. So making suffering, pain, and death, and indeed torture, indeed individuals who wish to inflict the maximum amount of pain on an innocent person, in fact, the most innocent person, the most just, moral, and holy man, is subjected to torture. That's the image of reality presented by Christianity. As Nietzsche says elsewhere, Christianity devalues the world by calling this world the place where the just man is tortured to death. And, perhaps this is an unintended consequence of attempting to show mankind the salvation on the other end of the cruelty and suffering of the world, or something like that, that they need to be paired because of the reality that life is suffering, something like that. I know these arguments could be made, but Nietzsche would say that that there was very much an intentionality behind the devaluation of the world in this way. And regardless of that intentionality, that is the effect that it has had. And to the point that we see images of torture in all of the major sacred sites of Christianity at this point, in the present year, right? You go into any church, the symbol of the cross is a symbol both of torture and the sublime. And so that's very interesting that we've married those two things together in our minds in the Western culture. And so yet again, this compassionless, pitying or unpitying Friedrich Nietzsche, right? That's how he's known. Here says, I want to be like Raphael. I don't want to paint another image of torture. I can find the sublime. I can find what's beautiful in things without having recourse to the ugliest and just the depths of human existence, right? The lowest aspects of human existence. And this ties back in with the things that Nietzsche said at the beginning of Book 4 about amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Looking away will be my only negation. I do not want to wage war on what is ugly, but I do wish to look away from it. And as he said in another aphorism in this book, because what is ugly makes you gloomy and bad. So there's something inherently gloomy about the sublime, about the sacred, about the beautiful as presented by Christianity. And we could say that, again, in the holy mystery, there might be something really powerful about seeing the transcendence of human pain and suffering and death and the beauty within that transcendence. But again, that involves the devaluation of the world, which is not something that Nietzsche's on board with. And to the extent that it's interesting too. Let's compare this with Birth of Tragedy, where he very much says that the Greeks, as a neurosis of the healthy, out of those who suffered from an overflowing vigor and vitality in life, needed tragedy out of a pessimism of strength. They wanted to look at the hard, terrible, cruel things in existence, and that there are images of stupendous, exquisite cruelty in the Greek tragedies. And this is precisely one of the things Nietzsche celebrates about the Greek tragedies. It's also the thing he said the other classicists didn't want to look at, the philologists didn't want to look at. That the Greeks were not the most humane people of ancient times, that in fact they were an exceedingly violent people who delighted in cruelty and things we would call evil deeds. And they had these dramatic representations where the tragic hero, who was often a noble man, Nietzsche emphasizes the noble man does not sin. It's not because he morally violated some rule, and therefore he deserves his fate. Oftentimes, he does not deserve his fate. Even if we could say it's brought about by hubris or something like that, in many cases, it's sort of contrived that way, or it's predestined to happen. We might think of Agamemnon. Sure, Agamemnon sort of defaces the holy tapestries by walking upon them, as though he were a conquering king, but he's manipulated into doing that by Clytemnestra, who's been plotting against him since the moment he returns home, and she's been planning to kill him the whole time. It's not clear that that's why the gods remove their sanction from Agamemnon, and that leads to his downfall. Clytemnestra sort of engineers all of this from the very beginning. The thing that kills Agamemnon is that he's not attentive. He's not attuned to the fact that his wife has murderous intentions towards him, which is perhaps, again, a form of hubris or foolishness, but it's not presented as though Agamemnon, quote-unquote, deserves it. Now, he does from Clytemnestra's perspective, but certainly not from his own. And, Oedipus Rex, sure, he kills his father and marries his mother, but this is precisely what the oracle predicted before, like at the moment of his birth, that Oedipus would eventually do. And none of it is intentional. So it's not as if the message of the story is not Oedipus shouldn't have done that. It's that through actions that he had no clue of the significance of at the time, he brings about this awful fate for himself that was in fact ordained. It was necessary from the beginning. Now, I've lingered on this point just because Nietzsche does seem to have perhaps a different attitude in his early work than he is displaying here. That there is something about confronting the brutal, terrible aspects of existence in order to bless existence and say, yes, life is so good that we will even behold the pain and cruelty of it and christen that as good. That's part of the early period of Nietzsche. Here, we might take it as a number of things. We could try and cohere those two ideas. We could say that perhaps there's some fundamental difference in the way that Christians viewed pain versus the way the Greeks did, and that by invoking Raphael and by implication the way that torture and the sublime are paired in Christianity and Christian art, that there's some fundamentally different thing going on. Or we could say perhaps Nietzsche had a revelation of his own, that he, in his aphorism for the new year and in his Sanctus Januarius poem, he's telling us, I've moved on from that. I don't need to have this intellectual predilection for the hard and the terrible any longer. I do not want to be a sublime assistant to torture. I just want to pass by all of this ugliness and cruelty. And because I realize now that that's a sort of way of weighing down the soul, of imposing the spirit of gravity onto it, that it's a way of thinking that robs us of our youth and robs us of our innocence, right? There's so much that Nietzsche is attempting to recapture innocence. And again, we could kind of cohere these ideas where we could say, well, the Greeks were capable of being innocent barbarians, but perhaps we are not. So the goal is innocence in any case. I think that gets us all into the weeds. I would just say there is a reason why there's no overall, what might we say, like grand, coherent, totally non-contradictory system in Nietzsche. And it's, again, because he's allowing different impulses to speak at different times, and he's not beholden to the same starting axioms or propositions at all times. In fact, I wouldn't even say he has starting axioms or propositions that create these logical chains. Or if he does, it's perhaps rhizomatic in the Deleuzian sense, right? That it's not this arboreal growth where one thing leads to another and branches out, but it's all around this central trunk. But there's no real center to Nietzsche's thought. What the center is can be reinterpreted at various points in his career. And so I think that another way of looking at this is Nietzsche's thought as a kind of experiment, that he's often his thoughts are presented in this way, where suppose that this is the case, or perhaps this is the case, or what if we imagine the following? Something like he's always posing these sort of thought experiments and so on and so forth. And because his thought is so experimental, it's not moving from one starting axiom and proceeding down the syllogistic chain, it's always sort of the center, where he's starting from, the proposition he's raising. He's just not concerned with establishing this schematizing coherence across his whole philosophy. So let's go to 314. Quote, "New domestic animals. I want to have my lion and eagle near me, so that I always have hints and omens that help me to know how great or small my strength is. Must I look down upon them today and feel fear? And will the hour return when they look up to me in fear?" End quote. So obviously in this book Zarathustra, eventually Zarathustra will have his eagle and his serpent. But he also has that parable of the camel, the lion, and the child. So it's interesting that both of those animals play a key role in this book Zarathustra, although not exactly in the form like the eagle's normally paired with the serpent. The lion's part of this other parable, but here Nietzsche says, "I want to have my lion and my eagle near me." And the passage is entitled New Domestic Animals, so it's like your dog and your cat that live in the house, your pets. And this is another somewhat koan-like passage, because there's no way I can tell you definitively what this passage means, because much is left up to the poetry, the sort of the lyricism. But consider what Nietzsche said about his dog, taking his pain, something inside of him, and giving it a sort of character. So when he talks about having his lion and his eagle near to him, so I always have hints and omens that help me to know how great or small my strength is. Remember that Nietzsche has this project of trying to comprehend, understand, and chart where his thoughts come from. I mean, I know I've already kind of brought up this theme before, but a line that comes to mind from Deleuze is, "Thought cannot think by itself, surely not." That what thinking is, thinking always seizes upon something, or thought rather is seized on by a given impulse. And so what we know from the way that Nietzsche uses the lion metaphor in Zarathustra, the lion sort of bellows his great no. That is the negative phase in the metamorphosis of the spirit, right? First you take on beliefs, you carry them, you carry these burdens. There are many different ways of carrying these burdens. And then you repudiate what you previously carried, what you held to be the most valuable and sacred. And that's sort of a bridge, a phase to the creation of new values, which must come out of a kind of innocence and childlike play and, again, vigor, vitality, and so on. But the lion is the phase that attacks that dragon with all of his scales in the metaphor that all glitter with "thou shalt," which Nietzsche says we ought to know every single one of those used to be an "I will." That they originated, that man, as he says in another passage, man did not receive his good and evil from a voice from heaven. Man created all of his good and evil. He fashioned it for himself. And, there's no power greater on earth than good and evil, but we created all of it. And so the dragon with his scales that glitter with "thou shalt" is sort of like the sum total, the tablet of values that appears so unchallengeable, unquestionable, because all of those "thou shalts" appear to be eternal, enduring truths that transcend this whirling world and all these different generations of human beings. Those, and all of our different various opinions and all of the actions and sins and ways we fall short of those, they seem to stand above us in judgment as eternal facts, when in fact, no. Nietzsche says they were created by mankind as well. And so the lion, therefore, has the strength to negate. It's sort of a symbol of the active nihilism, as Nietzsche will later discuss it in his notes and Wills of Power. The main trait of the eagle, on the other hand, would be its farsightedness. The fact that it flies up on high. So there's so many metaphors in Nietzsche about perspective, but literal vantage point, and the way that things look from when you're down within, say, in the forest, down on the forest floor looking up at the trees above you, versus being on the mountain peak looking down at the forest, which is all just sort of one mass of trees now. You see the entire thing. And just the way in which these moving up to a higher and higher perspective, that Nietzsche always correlates that with like higher and higher states of the soul, of elevated states. And so the way I would interpret this passage is that Nietzsche's lion and his eagle are sort of like the strongest and greatest things within him. His ability to be farsighted, to take elevated perspectives, to stand on mountaintops in regard to everything human, and also his lion, his ability to say no, to negate, or to attack positions which he believes, for whatever reason, need to be attacked. And so if we do take these as sort of like different impulses that Nietzsche has characterized in a certain way, on some days he looks down on them and feels fear. Other days, the hour returns when they look at him with fear. And this is sort of like, we were talking about holy mysteries earlier, that the holy mystery of the combination of cruelty and beauty, or torture and the sublime. And here I would say the holy mystery in Nietzsche that often reappears is sort of like the coherence of the self versus the multifariousness of the self. The fact that there is this person, this body, this apparent unity, which is in fact actually all of these different voices of a bunch of different competing and contrasting impulses, sometimes cooperating, but nevertheless all distinct from one another, non-identical to one another, certainly not a unity, more like an oligarchy of the self than a monarchy, and like a squabbling oligarchy of the self. Sometimes an oligarchy which is in a state of civil war even. Now, which one of those pictures of the self is correct? Well, as Nietzsche says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, self is a multiplicity and a unity, which is a contradiction in terms. And yet we have many examples of this. I mean, we could say that's pretty much true of every object, every event, every phenomenon, every person is both one thing and many things. Because, again, where the object, quote unquote, starts and stops is incredibly difficult to determine, I would say impossible. And it's... if you proceed with this analysis, you'll very quickly arrive at the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, that everything sort of depends on everything else or interdepends. And so is there a unity of the self? Or is there not? Because if there's no unity, the difference between inside and outside collapses. There is no single identical thing, only these competing impulses. But if we deny those impulses, if we deny that that's what the self really is, then we end up back at the soul superstition, the ego superstition. And I think, there is something to the fact that Nietzsche said it's a multiplicity and a unity. That the contradiction here perhaps is in language and is in grammar. It's in our tendency to conflate unequal things under the word concept that we produce these apparent contradictions. I think perhaps the reason why Nietzsche focused so much on the multifariousness of the self is precisely because of the fact that it was viewed from the perspective of a simple unity, we might say, for so long. Anyway, that again might take us into the weeds. I just think it's interesting to consider that there is something called me that Nietzsche's looking at, right? Sort of the central thing, the person that experiences the drives. Now, is that just the ego consciousness? Is that just this post hoc rationalization, this illusion of coherence that is retrospectively imposed upon this flickering memory of a discontinuous series of states? And much of Nietzsche's writing would certainly suggest that is the case. So you could take it that way. Perhaps it's just his ego consciousness looking to these impulses within him which he thinks are the strongest and checking those against his states, his moods, how he's feeling, what he's thinking on that day. Checking with those impulses to see how great or how small his strength is. But I think there's at least a good argument that there's some sort of unity of the self that Nietzsche is suggesting here that goes beyond the ego consciousness, insofar as can the ego consciousness, if it is just a post hoc rationalization, how can it have strength or a lack thereof? Isn't it just mostly an illusory continuity, like a simulacrum? It's not real, or it's not effective. It doesn't have strength in that way. And I don't know. I think, again, this is a very enigmatic passage, and there's a very experimental character to many of these aphorisms that we're covering today. Let's go to 315, quote, "On the last hour, storms are my danger. Will I have my storm of which I will perish, as Oliver Cromwell perished of his storm? Or will I go out like a light that no wind blows out, but that becomes tired and sated with itself, a burned out light? Or finally, will I blow myself out lest I burn out? End quote. And I mean, in modern times, who could help but thinking of the famous Neil Young lyric, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." Coming down certainly on the side that it's better to just blow out your own light than to let it slowly die and burn out all of its fuel, which certainly seems like I would say, a Nietzschean perspective on life. It's better to expend yourself in one big burst of energy than to slowly feel your strength in life slipping away from you. But so, okay, storms are my danger. Oliver Cromwell perished of his storm. What does Nietzsche mean there? Well, Cromwell died of, I think, malaria, and he didn't die like... Oliver Cromwell, he established himself as basically the dictator of like a new sort of like republic in Britain. It's a very interesting period in British history. And then after he died, they pretty much went back to doing things the way that they were prior to Cromwell. I know there were still downstream consequences of his reign. But so what is Nietzsche talking about here? Because a storm didn't like literally kill Cromwell. Well, Kaufman includes a helpful footnote. He says, quote, "Professor Lawrence Stone advises me Cromwell died just after one of the worst storms of the century." And then this is S. Butler from a poem, Hudibras. Quote, "Tossed in a furious hurricane, did Oliver give up his reign." The storm was generally taken to be symbolic of the collapse of all he had stood for, end quote. And so the storm is very obviously symbolic. I mean, Nietzsche's speaking of, we might think of, for example, it's funny because this is almost prophetic. Nietzsche's final year in which he wrote, he wrote or assembled 5 books and a collection of poems in that year. It's one of his most productive years. It's a storm of activity. That's how Hollingdale actually described his final year. And then he has his mental collapse, his illness, his condition finally claims him, and Nietzsche never regains his sanity. So he has this incredible year of incredibly high productive output, but he's writing like feverishly. And then within the first days of January in Turin, 1889, he collapses, and that's the end. And so he kind of does just go out with a storm. And so why would Nietzsche now write, obviously not knowing this, not knowing his own future, and say that storms are my danger? And I think Nietzsche often, it's funny that he praises the Greeks as a people of excess. I think largely because he is a person of excess, that it's sort of feast or famine with Nietzsche. And I think a lot of this will become very clear when we look at Klosowski's work next season, that Nietzsche would have these bouts of illness where it would almost become impossible for him to think. And when he was convalescing, he would sort of live an almost ascetic life where he sort of withdrew from his philosophical task. And he saw this as like a kind of liberation or a salvation from the pain of thinking. That, it's funny because elsewhere in this very book, he'll talk about thinking as a joy, but, so he would have these bursts of activity. He wrote Zarathustra, I think, in like a very, very short period of time, the first book. He would have these bursts where he would write his books and like, I think he wrote like the most of the first book of Human All Too Human in like 12 days or something like that. And it's a repeated theme with Nietzsche, where he would have these outbursts of incredible productivity. So just a storm of activity of his thinking, an excessive amount of thinking and feeling. And, another thing that was feast or famine with Nietzsche, apparently, is like, I can either go into solitude and have these wicked, questionable questions and thoughts, right? Or I could get absorbed within the sentimentality and mutual recognition and community of living with other people. And my whole philosophy totters when I experience the joy of that, right? Sort of like make up your mind, Nietzsche, but that's the thing. He's in some ways, for how regular his schedule was, he was a very mercurial person in terms of his inner states. And so he sort of predicts, will this be my downfall, right? One's demise is always of one's own making. So that's a quote from Hawkeye Goff, if anyone gets that reference. But, and the final line, well, perhaps will I blow myself out rather than burn out. And I referenced Neil Young's line that it's perhaps better to burn out than to fade away. I mean, you know who referenced that line in his suicide note was Kurt Cobain. That, he took that rather literally. It's funny to have Nietzsche, use more or less the same exact metaphor. And we know that during these times when he was having particularly rough bouts of illness, he sometimes flirted with suicidal ideation. He mentioned it to some friends and family members in his notes, and or implied it. Now, does this mean Nietzsche was actually suicidal? Perhaps he's not as life-affirming as he thinks. Well, remember what Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil. The thought of suicide can be a very powerful cure to. It can get you through many a terrible night. I forget exactly how he phrases it, but the thought of suicide could perhaps stop you from actually committing suicide. We also talked about that with like Cioran, and the translator of Cioran's first book speculated that even Goethe was doing this in his Sorrows of Young Werther, writing a young man in the storm of stress of youth who's a simulacrum of himself that he can then commit suicide through his character, and therefore he doesn't actually have to do it in real life. And perhaps even these words here in the Gay Science 315 are Nietzsche, by flirting with that idea in written form, a way of staving off actually doing the deed of living a bit longer. Okay, let's go on to 316. Quote, prophetic human beings. You have no feeling for the fact that prophetic human beings are afflicted with a great deal of suffering. You merely suppose that they have been granted a beautiful, quote, gift, and you would even like to have it yourself. But I shall express myself in a parable. How much may animals suffer from the electricity in the air and the clouds? We see how some species have a prophetic faculty regarding the weather, monkeys, for example, as may be observed even in Europe, and not only in zoos, namely on Gibraltar. But we pay no heed that it is their pains that make them prophets. When a strong positive electrical charge, under the influence of an approaching cloud that is as yet far from visible, suddenly turns into negative electricity, and a change of the weather is impending, these animals behave as if an enemy were drawing near, and prepare for defense or escape. Most often they try to hide. They do not understand bad weather as a kind of weather, but as an enemy whose hand they already feel. End quote. This is I think, an amazing passage considering. Okay, let's take the metaphor. Let's take it as a metaphor that Nietzsche is talking about prophetic human beings, as is the title of the aphorism. How would Nietzsche know this? Is he saying that he is a prophetic human being? I mean, that was certainly, many people have said that Nietzsche was prophetic. I just called him somewhat prophetic about the course of his own life a second ago. So, but Nietzsche, how would he know that? How would he know that he's a prophet, right? And I guess you could ask that about any prophet. How does any prophet know that the future that they have foreseen will actually come true? There's really no way to know. But certainly Nietzsche had experienced the pain portion of it, right? I mean, so is Nietzsche literally saying that, I am a pained, suffering prophet? I am literally seeing the future and foretelling it out of my own pain. Very interesting thing to consider, whether he might have thought that about himself. And, it's funny he uses this whole thing about predicting the weather, because he uses that example repeatedly in Human All Too Human, which is the beginning of Nietzsche's more naturalistic period. Some people call it a positivistic period. I think naturalist is a better way of putting it. And he repeatedly disparages the idea of prophecy in that book. And he specifically uses the example of foretelling the weather. And he says, by chance, when somebody accurately foretells the weather, then people begin to attribute prophetic abilities to them. And then once you're already in the mindset of thinking that someone can foretell the future, you start looking for the ways in which their words could be interpreted as actually foretelling what happened. Perhaps they don't need to be taken so literally. People do this all the time. Remember the papal prophecies that people brought up when this new pope was just put in, that this is going to be the last pope, because they were these papal prophecies that, they said he would be the last pope, and then, it'll be the end times. And then when you actually look through like the list of popes that they so-called prophesized, the things that they said about all of these popes are like incredibly vague, like basically like little prose poems of prophecies. Like one of the popes had just said like roaring lion, right? What does that mean? I mean, that's as much open to interpretation as the aphorism we looked at a couple sections ago, the new domestic animals. What does it mean when Nietzsche invokes the lion and the eagle in that passage, right? It's one thing to do that interpretation when we're reading a philosophy book. It's another to like try and fit the facts of history into like, creating interpretations of prophecy in order to say that they actually played out in history. Like, I think the Bible also proves you could interpret things in so many different ways, that, unless it's like incredibly clear and concrete, it's very hard to take the power of prophecy seriously in that sense. Anyway, my point in bringing all this up is that Nietzsche actually makes these arguments himself in Human All Too Human. He actually advances these arguments, and he specifically uses the example about predicting the weather. But it's funny because it's like he's noticed here animals can predict the weather, right? And why? And I'm wondering if he was making the analogy from himself that like, does my pain give me insight? Is it the fact that, and the other, I'm sorry, I'm just making so many connections with this passage. I'm kind of feel like I'm jumping around here, but there's that, the note in an early note from Nietzsche where he says, we don't sense every potential like physical phenomenon that's around us. So we only sense what our organs pick up on. So we have eyes to see light, photons, and we have ears to hear sound waves, so on and so forth. There's also an electrical field. We don't have an organ that senses the electrical field, but there's no reason why we couldn't have one. I mean, some animals certainly do seem to sense the electrical field, and that in fact might have to do with the way that birds migrate. It might have to do with why animals can predict the weather in this way. And so it's funny because he like ridiculed earlier the idea of like attributing to people prophetic powers because of their ability to predict the weather. But it's almost like his later musings coming out of that like neo-Kantian or post-Kantian like way of looking at the phenomenal world as inevitably mediated by our sense organs, and like then the thought that different animals with different organs would experience a different world. You might be able to therefore experience sensations that would quote unquote predict or prophesize things that were going to happen that would really be the same as us just seeing, like your eyes can see a train coming visually, right? What if you could see, quote unquote, or feel the electrical field shifting, right? It wouldn't actually be prophecy. It's just a sensation that the rest of us wouldn't have. And so it's like perhaps that thought occurs to Nietzsche. And then what occurs to me thinking about that is people who like, I've known someone who like broke her toe when she was younger, and then she could tell when it was going to rain, right? Because there would be pain in the toe that broke, or like when the weather was going to get colder. And lots of people report this, that they can sort of like feel a pain in an old injury that actually allows them to predict the weather in sort of the way that Nietzsche is talking about here. So did it occur to Nietzsche that that sort of thing might be possible? That there might be a person who can prophesize out of a literal physiological pain? Does it perhaps have nothing to do with Nietzsche's own prophetic abilities? But again, it is just interesting because, I mean, for an example of this, I mean, look at Jordan Peterson. He will regularly draw upon the passages in Will to Power where Nietzsche says, I prophesize the coming of the next 2 centuries. This is what's going to happen. And, Nietzsche predicted millions of people would die in the coming 2 centuries and wars over our values, right? And Nietzsche did more or less predict that. The question would be like, does it count as a prediction? I think would be the sticking point with a lot of like more scientifically or empirically minded people out there, right? Like if you just guess at something happening, and this was much Nietzsche's own point in Human All Too Human, and that you just guess at something happening and you happen to be successful, that's not like a real prediction. You just happen to be right. It's like going to the roulette table and saying, I'm going to put it all on black, this number, and then you roll the dice and you win. Doesn't mean you knew that was going to happen. You happened to call it in that particular circumstance. So that's why it's always been questionable to me to call Nietzsche a prophet. But it's just interesting because we can't help but think of Nietzsche in the description that he gives in this passage. All right, let's go to 317. Quote, looking back, the true pathos of every period of our life rarely becomes clear to us as long as we live in this period. Then we always assume that it is the only state that is possible and reasonable for us, and, to speak with the Greeks and adopt their distinction, an ethos and not a pathos. A few musical chords reminded me today of a winter and a house and an extremely solitary life, as well as the feeling in which I lived at that time. I thought that I might go on living that way forever, but now I comprehend that it was wholly pathos and passion, and thus comparable to this painful and bold music that was so certain that there was some comfort. That sort of thing one must not have for years or for eternities, otherwise one would become too supra-terrestrial for this planet. End quote. So here we have another confessional section. Another confessional aphorism from Nietzsche. I mean, he expands it to say, the true pathos of every period of our life rarely becomes clear to us as long as we live in this period. But clearly he's speaking of himself, as he says. He gives an anecdote of hearing some musical chords that conjured a memory for him. A winter and a house and an extremely solitary life, as well as the feeling in which I lived at that time. I thought that I might go on living that way forever. And so I think this reveals a great deal about how Nietzsche philosophizes once again, while also managing to be relatively relatable. I mean, I think the insight that he draws from his own experience is that every impulse, when it has its grip on us, when it has its hold on us, or we might not say impulse, I mean, every feeling, every particular sentimentality or tonality of our soul at a given moment presents itself as an eternal fact, as an eternal truth. Especially states like depression and melancholia can represent themselves as if they're going to last forever, that this is just the truth of who you are and how you're going to feel about the world now. But, of course, this is not just an emotional reality because Nietzsche ties it to a memory of a certain place, a certain way of life, we might say. And so there's this relationship between, we set ourselves in a certain environment, perhaps have a certain occupation, relation to other people, our family, our friends. We have a certain series of experiences, of sensations that we repeat through every day or perhaps weekly. And within that way of life, that modus vivendi, that creates a certain, we might say, song of the soul. In the same way of a musical composition, you could see all of those, that procession of states, of inner states, as sort of like a repeating, leitmotif or something like that. And in fact, there is one of Nietzsche's notes, it's perhaps why I'm thinking of this, where he says that the time will come where we will be able to read a musical composition as the narrative of the impulses or inner states of the composer, like a map. We could see what each one corresponds to, each interval in the music, each section, like what each phrase, what kind of impulse does this correspond to? What kind of inner story does this reveal to us? And then he goes further and says, we could even do this with our philosophy as well. So when he says the distinction of an ethos and not a pathos, there is that, it presents itself as a stable fact of our character rather than a fleeting emotional event, right? Rather than a stable, enduring trait. We go through phases, periods of life, ways of living, different emotional tonalities in life, and every single one of them seems to be part of, a firm part of who we are, rather than something which will eventually give rise to something new. That's something that's actually a rather fleeting state of affairs. that we have a periodicity to our lives. And the implication, of course, at the end is that if you stay within a pathos for years or for eternities, because each of them we can only comprehend as a pathos sort of in retrospect, it is the fact that who we are continues to become, and we proceed through this periodicity, that we can recognize them retrospectively for what they were. A certain state of mind, again, or tonality of the soul. We don't really have like one good single word in English for what I'm trying to get at here, but I think hopefully I've conveyed it. We can kind of see that in retrospect, that it's a procession and none of them were enduring facts about ourselves. But the longer you inhabit one of them, one feeling of the soul, the longer that one impulse wants to tyrannize and play master, and that Nietzsche would later say in Beyond Good and Evil, again, because thought does not think by itself. When thought is seized on by a tyrannical impulse, that's what Nietzsche calls like dogmatism, at least in the philosophical form, where there's one ruling thought that really doesn't permit anything else, where the philosopher establishes a single axiom and then everything proceeds from that, and it never fundamentally alters. He begins to shape his all of his subsequent syllogisms sort of around the foregone conclusion of what the one ruling impulse has already determined must be the truth. And so I think thinking about that in relation to this passage, occupying that same sort of state of the soul for years or for eternities, you become too supra-terrestrial for this planet. That this is fundamentally how the thou shalt is rigidified, how it cools and hardens out of the initial lava flow of the I will, that you establish these sort of moral or religious regimes over human cultures and societies, and the priest as this alchemist of the spirit, or of the alchemist of concepts and feelings, attempts to maintain certain states of the soul, maintain the populace within this sort of state. We might say in Christianity, it's like piety, penitence. Penitence is probably the best word. Maintaining that state for years and years, it becomes a sort of eternal fact. That, again, we've talked about all of this a great deal, so that's why I think he says you would become too supra-terrestrial for this planet, so too metaphysical, too attuned to... that there's something about staying in the same state of the soul, being locked into that tyrannical impulse for decades, millennia, eternities, whatever it is, that produces otherworldly proclivities. That's what otherworldism is. One of Nietzsche's perennial enemies in his philosophy is being rigidified into one state of the soul, because then that's where we get this notion, perhaps, of truths which transcend the momentary, the flux, the becoming. In a way, a very subtle and fascinating passage. But yeah, let's move on to 3:18. Quote, "Wisdom in pain. There is as much wisdom in pain as there is in pleasure. Both belong among the factors that contribute the most to the preservation of the species. If pain did not, it would have perished long ago. That it hurts is no argument against it, but its essence. In pain, I hear the captain's command, 'Take in the sails.' The bold seafarer, man, must have mastered the art of doing 1,000 things with his sails. Otherwise, he would be done for in no time, and the ocean would swallow him. We must learn to live with diminished energies, too. As soon as pain gives its safety signal, the time has come to diminish them. Some great danger or other, a storm is approaching, and we are well advised to inflate ourselves as little as possible. True, there are people who hear precisely the opposite command when great pain approaches. Their expression is never prouder, more warlike, and happier than it is when a storm comes up. Indeed, pain itself gives them their highest moments. This is the heroic type, the great pain-bringers of humanity, those few or rare human beings who need the very same apology that pain itself needs, and truly one should not deny it to them. They contribute immensely to the preservation and enhancement of the species, even if it were only by opposing comfortableness and by not concealing how this sort of happiness nauseates them." End quote. So we return to the themes of the first book once again. And in fact, Nietzsche uses the exact same phrasing as, if we'll remember, because we refreshed this just a couple weeks ago when we began with Book 4, that whatever could have harmed the species would have perished long ago. Whatever way of life, whatever philosophy of life you come up with, it will advance and preserve the species. And he says the same thing of evil individuals. And here he says the same thing about pain. That it hurts is no argument against it. If pain did not contribute to the preservation of the species, it would have perished. And then the final lines. They contribute immensely to the preservation and enhancement of the species. Who's he talking about? The pain bringers of humanity. And he says it's by opposing comfortableness and by not concealing how this sort of happiness nauseates them. So as we've gone over, the strong type, the exception, the immoral type, the type who lives outside the rules, the criminal, the barbarian, the ambitious person, the person who violates and smashes the tablets of value of the society, that type is valuable. He's just as valuable as the man who lives with his herd instinct, because even the herd instinct is preserved or enhanced by this type of person. Even the rule is strengthened by the exception. Why? Because, again, he keeps us on our toes. He requires us to keep our martial qualities cultivated, we might say, in the terms of like literal combat between, say, the barbarians at the gates and the established civilization. But this also happens in more subtle ways, on the psychological level, the moral level, the religious level. You could see how Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church, in Nietzsche's understanding, strengthened the Catholic Church. It gave them a siege mentality, created Jesuitism and the Counter-Reformation. And so that's why Nietzsche says that the pain bringers of humanity are the true heroic type. They're the ones who are driving the species forward. This is a theme he's sounded throughout this book, so we don't really need to go over it much more than this. But this is interesting because it ties in with pain on the physiological level. We might even say psychological pain is the way that Nietzsche understands it here. A means, not an end. This ties in with his critique of utilitarianism, the idea that measuring the worthwhileness of existence, or the value of existence, according to pleasure or pain, is fundamentally wrong-headed, because pleasure and pain are not the ends, the goals of existence. Or rather, it's not that pleasure is a positive goal and pain a negative goal. They're both means of pushing the organism. And the metaphor he gives here is another seafaring metaphor. It's the captain's command, take in the sails. So when you experience pain, it's sort of like, in the most basic level, right? You put your hand on the stove, you didn't know it was hot, you feel the heat, you instantly pull your hand back. So whatever the organism is pushing towards, pushing into, they experience pain, draw back. It's time to pull in the sails. That is the value of pain. But it's interesting that he says that there are other types who have the opposite orientation towards pain. They want to push further into it. The obvious example of this, again in physiological terms, is no pain, no gain. We all know that from the old gym slogan. But Nietzsche, he means this in terms that go far beyond that. He means it in terms of a warlike instinct to experience the pain of resistance from an opposing force and be sort of enlivened by it and want to push further, dig further in. You get pushback from the enemy in a military, in a battle, and the soldiers go berserk. They go into a frenzy. And what is that one? That dictum of Sun Tzu, I believe, that you should position your troops so their backs are at a body of water, so that they can't retreat, so that the choice is between fighting and death. Like, you can't disperse and run away and retreat. So the only option is to fight till the end, and that you will reliably win more battles that way. Or the anecdote that Cortez, when he arrived in the New World, burned his ships so that his men would not have any thought of going and sailing back for the Old World before accomplishing their task. So especially if there's no other alternative, you can actually sort of conjure this out of people, where the pain becomes something that you have to push through in order to succeed. And so what's interesting about this is that Nietzsche, again, is showing us that it's not the objective truth, quote unquote, of pain or pleasure that matters so much as what we do with it, what we use it as a means to accomplish. In both of the cases he gives, we could see pain as something useful, something that causes us either to draw back or to push further. But in either case, it's being used as a means, and this is why it must have value. That its continued existence speaks to its value for existence, and thus there must be wisdom in pain. And this aphorism, it just relates to so much of Nietzsche's broader philosophy. Let's go to 319. Quote, "As interpreters of our existence, one sort of honesty has been alien to all founders of religions and their kind. They have never made their experiences a matter of conscience for knowledge. What did I really experience? What happened in me and around me at that time? Was my reason bright enough? Was my will opposed to all deceptions of the senses and bold in resisting the fantastic? None of them has asked such questions, nor do any of our dear religious people ask them even now. On the contrary, they thirst after things that go against reason, and they do not wish to make it too hard for themselves to satisfy it. So they experience miracles and rebirths, and hear the voices of little angels. But we others who thirst after reason, are determined to scrutinize our experiences as severely as a scientific experiment, hour after hour, day after day. We ourselves wish to be our experimenters and guinea pigs." End quote. I've already mentioned Nietzsche's experimental method, his experimental approach to thought, but this is a wonderful passage for understanding how, again, Nietzsche tries to understand his thought as something which is seized upon by impulses, to ask incisive, inquisitive questions about he says that this sort of honesty has been alien to founders of religions and their kind. So when we come to a grand thought, or a belief, or a conviction, or a moral idea, or a certain justification for our existence, we should ask, what did I really experience? What happened in me and around me at the time? And so remember how Nietzsche tries to understand his own thoughts and their origins. Was I healthy or sick when I said this? Was this a period of convalescence, or was it a period when I felt like I was getting worse? What kind of climate was I in? Remember when Nietzsche says he doesn't trust any thought that he has while sitting still. All of his best thoughts come to him while walking. So that's, on a very basic level, what's happening in you and around you at the time. What was I doing when that thought came to me? How was I feeling? Where was I in terms of the climate and the altitude? What was the overall mood that was associated with the thought? And therefore to ask, these become, as he says, scientific sort of experiments in a way. We who thirst after reason are determined to scrutinize our experiences. And this is in contrast with people who sort of just experience their experiences as a sort of through mythical or religious frameworks where they experience miracles and rebirths. It's just funny because this is like how I would say a Jungian or certain modern day interpreters of Jung, how they would think that we should approach our lives. We should become more mystical with our lives. We should look at our experiences as mysterious and symbolic, perhaps in archetypal terms, even apparently random and spontaneous experiences. We should weave them into this sort of narrative archetypal fabric, and into this language of symbols and everything, of frankly drawing upon religious values and stories in order to better understand our lives. And it's funny that Nietzsche is so often compared with Jung, but this is really the opposite sort of consideration or a repudiation to that. We should be more scrutinizing. We should be more incredulous. We should try to get into the guts, into the guts of our thought, the physiology that creates our psychology. Consider the little things that stack up to make these grand ideas. And if we were to do this as regards the existing religious ideas, because obviously the religious patriarchs and prophets and priests and ascetic figures have not sufficiently done this themselves. They have not introspected in this way. If their followers were to put these questions to them, what would they find? And in fact, many times, I would say, people are not even taking account of the circumstances of their thoughts, of whether they come walking or sitting, or whether they come with a mood that is morbid, or a mood that is jubilant, or whether, were they hungry or were they full, or all of these sorts of little questions you could do experimentally You could look at the fact that Nietzsche spontaneously wrote down sort of his thoughts every day and kept a record of his thoughts in this way is kind of like that experimental material. And while I haven't done such a thing myself, I wonder what that would be like to sort of keep a record of all my thoughts and when they come and what the circumstances were and try and piece out, for example, what kind of thoughts come to me when I'm lacking in bravery, when I'm weary, when I'm tired, right? So as interpreters of our experiences, very important passage here. Let's go to 320. Quote, upon seeing each other again, A, do I still understand you well? You are seeking. Where is your nook and star in the actual world? Where can you lie down in the sun so that you, too, reap in excess of well-being and your existence justifies itself? Let everyone do that for himself, you seem to me to be saying, and let everyone put out of his mind generalities and worries about others and about society. B, what I want is more. I am no seeker. I want to create for myself a son of my own. End quote. So 2 episodes ago when we covered the aphorism Embark Philosophers, where Nietzsche speaks of discovering many new suns. And here he shifts the metaphor to creating new suns. That's what the second speaker wants, something more than simply finding their nook and their star in the actual world among all of these other choices of, we might say, all of the different ways that we have morally justified our existence or philosophically justified our existence, which is what the sun is a metaphor for. And Nietzsche says the moral earth, too, has its antipodes. So in the whole world of morality, you could sail around to the opposite side and find, perhaps in this strange sort of metaphor, an opposite sun, a different star that shines just for you, a place where you can lie down, and as he says, he makes it clear, reap in excess of well-being and have your existence justify itself. Like that, he's spoken about this so much throughout Book 4, and so to understand this aphorism, just go back to some of the previous episodes. But what the second speaker wants is more. I'm no seeker, I want to create. So I don't want to dig among the various creations of others. I want to create out of myself. I want to fashion my very own sun. And not much more to say philosophically here, except that the title, Upon Seeing Each Other Again. So this strikes me as perhaps a summary of a meeting between Nietzsche and someone he hadn't seen in a long time. And there's no way to know who he's talking about, but we could imagine it might be somebody like Overbeck, somebody who might have a different world outlook from Nietzsche, but they're trying to understand in the first bit of dialogue, where A is saying, do I still understand you well? You're seeking your nook, your place, your star in the actual world. And I think B would be Nietzsche saying, what I want is more than that, I am no seeker. So really, I think just another very personal aphorism here. Let's go to 321, quote, new caution. Let us stop thinking so much about punishing, reproaching, and improving others. We rarely change an individual, and if we should succeed for once, something may also have been accomplished unnoticed. We may have been changed by him. Let us rather see to it that our own influence on all that is yet to come balances and outweighs his influence. Let us not contend in a direct fight, and that is what all reproaching, punishing, and attempts to improve others amount to. Let us rather raise ourselves that much higher. Let us color our own example ever more brilliantly. Let our brilliance make them look dark. No, let us not become darker ourselves on their account, like all those who punish others and feel dissatisfied. Let us sooner step aside. Let us look away. End quote. Again, looking away shall be my only negation. This is yet again that the feeling of Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy. We might say the feeling of being an active force in the world. Put it in Deleuze's terms once again. That Deleuze draws upon that passage in Genealogy where Nietzsche says that the master morality has the pleasure of knowing itself different. And remember, so the master morality begins with a yes to what is inside, a yes to itself. The noble soul has reverence for itself. It's one of Nietzsche's coinages from Beyond Good and Evil. It begins with saying, I am good. what I am is good. The type I represent is good. And everything else that doesn't measure up to that, to my own self-legislated standards, is bad. But they're not evil in the sense that the Christian thinks they're evil. I'm not defining my existence by having to destroy them. If anything, by comparison, I just feel that much better about myself. I already am this active affirmative force, a different force, not dialectically related to others, not seeking their mutual recognition, but rather this is a pluralistic world where there are just various different types of forces that are not essentially related to one another, as in their essence related to one another. And the types that are noblest, as Nietzsche defines them, are precisely the types that, as he's defined it throughout Book 4, are the most satisfied with themselves, with who and what they are. They feel their philosophical justification for life as a sun that shines just for them, whether they sought it out or created it, or whether it was given to them, right? And that's the essential orientation of the master morality, beginning with a yes to oneself, whereas the slave morality begins with a no to what is outside, a no to what causes fear or which causes harm, or which is feared to cause harm, rather. The slave morality is externally directed. Begins with that no, and therefore it's always concerned with stamping out evil. Ressentiment is essentially other-directed. It's essentially a reaction. It's essentially living in reaction. And so here on a personal level, not so much a moral level, although morality could certainly be involved, Nietzsche is saying, let us just raise ourselves that much higher. Let's color our own example ever more brilliantly. Let our brilliance make them look dark. Look dark to who? To them? Well, that's not really what Nietzsche's getting at, because he's sort of saying we should pass by this whole need to punish, to discipline, to improve and reproach others, whatever it might be. And it's funny because that's what all of our moral regimes purport to do. It's a large part of what the legal regime purports to do, to rehabilitate people, actually make the criminal better, right? It's to their benefit that they've been incarcerated and rehabilitated. They can be a more functional member of society. And what Nietzsche says that I think foreshadows the genealogy of morals: let us not become darker ourselves on their account, like those who punish others and feel dissatisfied. And remember also, thus spoke Zarathustra: distrust all in whom the urge to punish is powerful. And this is just the basic Nietzschean observation, again, that weakness corrupts, that indulging in ressentiment and vindictiveness and petty absorption and concern with someone else that you would reproach, that you don't approve of, that you would judge to be immoral, that you would wish to punish, that makes you worse. So it's interesting that we think by punishing we're making the criminal better, but we're actually making ourselves worse. That something may have gone unnoticed, and that we may have been changed by him, the one who we attempt to punish. Of course, this draws to mind the he who fights monsters runs the risk of becoming a monster, aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil. And I suppose I would say as a final note, I mean, you could obviously say that there are many instances in which you might have to fight monsters, or in which looking away is not an option. But I don't think this aphorism is not really addressing itself to those situations. And besides, I think it's helpful to think in Greek terms, as Nietzsche says, it's the person, or again in terms of the master morality, that it's the person who has the power to requite, the power to meet your force with their own force, who is noble, regardless of whether they're your enemy or not. And it's the person who lacks that power who is bad, as in the sense of contemptible, just not worth it. And so, the Greek morality totally permits you could fight someone, right? You could be at war with someone and practice horrible cruelty against one another without actually hating them. Is that actually a historical reality? That's something we could debate, but that's, at least in Nietzsche's retelling of the master and slave morality, that's how he sees things. That it's actually not about the kinds of judgments you're making to morally condemn, are totally independent of whether or not you are at war with the other party or something like that. And I think, especially here in the gay science, it's just very clear that he's sounding this theme. Let us step aside, let us look away. It's very much, I think, the essence of Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy, affirming what I am without a care for what others see in me or recognize in me, or without a care for trying to change other people to be like me. Let's go to 322. Quote, parable. Those thinkers in whom all stars move in cyclic orbits are not the most profound. Whoever looks into himself as into vast space and carries galaxies in himself also knows how irregular all galaxies are. They lead into the chaos and labyrinth of existence. End quote. And this one's funny because thinkers on whom all stars move in cyclic orbits are not the most profound. Is that not what Nietzsche's eternal return suggests? I mean, not literally stars and planets, but all things in the entirety of existence move in a cyclical movement in terms of this circular structure of time. I think it's interesting to consider that there are some notes where Nietzsche attempts to sort of syncretize eternal return with chaos. I believe it's in a letter to Gast where he says that the eternal return is totally compatible with the notion of chaos. And it's probably helpful to remember Heidegger's understanding of eternal return as stamping becoming with the character of being, which is an interpretation that I share, that essentially eternal return is not meant to portray some sort of orderliness to the universe. It's not a doctrine where we say that all the apparent randomness of becoming or the apparent chaos of becoming is actually, there's a secret, a hidden order behind it, which is being. It's actually to say that the being is the becoming, that, as Heraclitus said, becoming is the fabric, the cloth of existence, without appearance, without coming into being and passing away, constant transformation and flux. The one, the arche, does not appear at all. The only way it appears is through becoming. And so I think it's Nietzsche taking that chaotic world of flux and then saying every single fleeting moment is an eternal truth in a sense, because it will recur, it will always return. And so that's the best I can do at sort of making this passage cohere with Nietzsche's broader project. And I guess as a final note, Kaufman reads this as a critique of philosophical systems. That's how he views this. And he cites the aphorism from Zarathustra that one must have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, which I think is a fine interpretation as well. Let's go to 323, quote, good luck in fate. The greatest distinction that fate can bestow on us is to let us fight for a time on the side of our opponents. With that, we are predestined for a great victory, end quote. And again, might be helpful to look at Kaufman's footnote where he says, Nietzsche began as a writer or as a fighter on the side of Richard Wagner. So he fights for some time on the side of his opponents, sort of the Wagnerians or something like that. So perhaps this is another confessional aphorism, but I think this one is actually much more universally applicable insofar as, there's no one who's better at critiquing an ideology or religion than a former adherent who knows it inside and out and came to see for himself, not out of a skepticism that kept it out of arm's length, but from being so close to it, to have it be the closest thing to his heart, saw for himself all the flaws and the ways at which it seems to fall apart at the seams. So ex-Mormons, ex-Scientologists, ex-Muslims, ex-Christians for that matter. But I think of all those are generally good examples because, not everyone knows a whole lot about Mormonism or Scientology or Islam in the Western world. And so usually it's like the critics that come to the forefront in the public consciousness, that are the really powerful critics, are the ones that have been a part of it. Because most people don't have the impetus to study these things from afar, because usually it's like mainstream Christianity is the devil that we know, or like mainstream secular progressive ideology is the devil that we know. But like if you want to hear a really good criticism of any former ideology, look to the people who were the true believers and then lost their faith in it. So with that, you're predestined to a great victory. If fate bestows that on you, that you're you're destined to become a critic or an attacker of this ideology, then fate can bestow you a great gift by having you be an adherent of it early on, because you'll simply have the greatest understanding of it. Okay, it's time for one of my favorite aphorisms in the whole book. This is number 324. Quote, "In media vita, no, life has not disappointed me. On the contrary, I find it truer, more desirable, and mysterious every year. Ever since the day when the great liberator came to me, the idea that life could be an experiment of the seeker for knowledge, and not a duty, not a calamity, not trickery. And knowledge itself, let it be something else for others, for example, a bed to rest on, or the way to such a bed, or a diversion, or a form of leisure. For me, it is a world of dangers and victories in which heroic feelings, too, find places to dance and play. Life as a means to knowledge. With this principle in one's heart, one can live not only boldly, but even gaily, and laugh gaily, too. And who knows how to laugh anyway, and live well, if he does not first know a good deal about war and victory." End quote. So in media vita means in the middle of life, or in midlife. I might say these are Nietzsche's thoughts upon approaching middle age. And it's written not only in the midst of life itself, in the midst of the hustle and bustle of Genoa, but also in the middle of Nietzsche's life. So if we'll recall that section, Preparatory Men, in which Nietzsche calls for us to live dangerously, build our cities on the slopes of Vesuvius, it's funny that, again, as I brought up when I was sort of going through it, there is a sort of literal, warlike, interpretation of that passage. To literally live dangerously, to literally become more warlike and virile men. That's certainly there. But the entire passage, if you look at it in context, of what he actually says, very clear that he's talking about warlike virtues being applied to knowledge, being infused into the search for knowledge. He says, the reason why I welcome a new warlike age is that this will carry through into the search for knowledge in a way that has never existed before. So that new warlike age is a means to an end of the search for knowledge becoming more heroic, becoming more warlike. Reconceiving what the search for knowledge is, it's not the dry and dusty activity of the scholar, but the heroic quest of the warrior. Because, of course, we discover through Nietzsche's work that too much truth can be fatal, and that the strength of a soul can be measured by how much truth he could tolerate, that the community sets their ban on certain truths, demands certain lies, and that if you stray outside of the city walls, the protection or the sanction of your community, you will feel the sting of conscience. You will earn their ire and their distrust. They'll call you immoral. They'll be perhaps malicious towards you if you are willing to search for truth outside of the sanction of your community, the Overton window of what's acceptable to discuss. So what's really needed for the search for truth is not erudition or just an excess of rationality or something. What's needed is bravery, courage, above all. That's what's needed for the search for truth. And that's why the new warlike age is a means to an end for a new warlike search for knowledge. And then here he speaks in the terms of knowledge, again, as something that, what does he say? A world of dangers and victories in which heroic feelings too find places to dance and play. So quite literally, this was the great liberator for Nietzsche, was to reconceive of knowledge in this sense. And he also, again, uses the language of experiment. Life could be an experiment for the seeker for knowledge. And experiment is a dangerous thing. I think we should remember that. We shouldn't think of experiment in declawed, sedate terms of men in white lab coats. We should think of the experiments of the mad scientist, Dr. Frankenstein, attempting to steal the fire from the gods, the ability to place that spark of life, to animate matter, right? That's why he's the modern-day Prometheus. That kind of experiment. And indeed, in Shelley's book, that experiment goes horribly wrong. The monster that he creates gets out of hand and it causes all sorts of horrific tragedy for Dr. Frankenstein. But in any case, I mean, Nietzsche also has that line in Beyond Good and Evil where he baptizes his free spirits with the names experimenters, or they could also be called tempters or attempters. So those who seduce, they tempt us, and they also make attempts. So it's a double entendre that comes through much better in German, but I think tempter and attempter works just fine in English, actually. And I think it draws out that there is something, there's an air of wickedness about experimentation. That, the way we talk about experimentation in terms outside of science, say in the United States, a very common thing that people would often say, I don't know if they say it anymore, is like, if a political figure or somebody respected, it comes out that they did drugs, when they were younger, they'll say, well, I experimented with drugs when I was in college, right? What does that mean? It's sort of like, well, I decided to try it. I decided to try something that not only the law, but also perhaps the morality of my community is against. And I did it anyway, because I wanted to know what it was like. I ran this experiment on what? On myself, right? I experimented by introducing these drugs into my physiology in spite of the fact that you told me not to. You told me I could go to jail if I did that, and I did it anyway. But for some reason, this is taken as like an acceptable thing, like, oh, it was just an experiment, right? But that reveals how there's like, again, Nietzsche talks about this playfulness in this passage. That's really the sense of experimentation, right? Experimenting with drugs is maybe a good way of kind of capturing the idea of the gay science, right? Again, as I've said, the reason why I prefer to keep it translated that way, because gay has this it's an antiquated term. We don't really use it to mean joyous anymore, but Nietzsche certainly means it in that sense, and it has the sense of like devil may care, a devil may care attitude towards things. We might say careless, but also carefree. And so I suppose I would just say socially, like we allow for a few brief excursions into that, right, in our own social context. But it's, I guess what I'm trying to draw out with the way we colloquially use the term is that it does reveal that it's something that we think is wrong or against the rules. We're experimenting, we're sort of flouting the rules. And so the experimenter in the domain of morality, religion, metaphysics, and truth claims, these are all very dangerous things to experiment with. What would it really mean to experiment with morality, with the deep morality of our culture? Has anyone ever done this? Woken up one day and said, today I'm going to steal, or I'm going to lie and deceive, or commit murder even, or just let me do something evil just to see what it's like, just to try it, just to do an experiment on myself. What does it feel like to be immoral or evil? This sounds like something out of a Marquis de Sade novel, but that shows you, like, what do we really want people running experiments with morality? What kind of prospect is that? And of course, there's the famous note from Nietzsche's Notes for Zarathustra, or I don't know how famous it is, but I'm going to make it famous. It's one of my favorites, where he says, "We're conducting an experiment with truth. Perhaps mankind shall perish because of it. Fine." That's a devil may care attitude if I've ever heard one. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Because an experiment with what? Truth? Like, by challenging our philosophical or religious ideological truth claims, you might cause mankind to perish. Well, there are those who would hold that if we were to truly take Nietzsche's critiques as challenges to our moral and metaphysical truths seriously, it could deliver our society over to ruin. Could our cultural ideas and social mores and all of these things survive the critique of the ego as a coherent self, the critique of the will, a critique of intentionality, a philosophy of total moral irresponsibility? If these things were to take hold, would we really survive? Do we really want people experimenting with these things from the standpoint of preserving the species as it is now? And so I think a great deal of traditional moralists would quite agree with Nietzsche that his experiments with truth could lead to the perishing of mankind if people were to take them seriously. But this is all just to say that is the exciting and dangerous nature of calling life an experiment for the seeker of knowledge. That's why he ties experimentation also to war and victory as a play of dangers and victories with heroic feelings in them as well. And perhaps the biggest point for me is the fact that he says life as a means to knowledge. This is an emphasized part of the passage put in quotes. With this principle in one's heart, one can live not only boldly, but even gaily and laugh gaily too. And the one that Nietzsche speaks of in that passage, I don't think is necessarily anyone. I think it's specifically Nietzsche, because he starts out by saying, no, life has not disappointed me. He said, it titles it In the Middle of Life or in Midlife, clearly about him. I find it truer, it being life, more desirable and mysterious every year. And so I think it's clear that Nietzsche is saying, this is the sun that I have found, or perhaps that I've created. This great liberator came to me, right? Well, did it come from outside or from inside? Well, that might be a sort of a false dichotomy, right? An impulse spoke through Nietzsche that said that life could be a means to knowledge. And that is the sun that justifies his existence as a philosopher. Which is very strange because of the fact that his search for knowledge involves this critique of truth. And the fact that, as Peterson often summarized Nietzsche's view, Nietzsche says truth ought to serve life, not that life ought to serve truth or something like that. But here he says life as a means to knowledge is the great liberator for him. That's the way in which he can live and laugh and love. Love this existence, right? I love those memes where they just have Nietzsche saying live, laugh, love, and all the philosophers he influenced are like, wow, so deep. But it does come down to that. But he's saying it's not such an easy thing to find a way for you to love your life and for you to feel your life to be eternally and supremely justified. That might require a great deal of experiment with yourself, a great deal of searching, or an act of creation if you can find no nook on earth where the sun really shines for you. So how do we reconcile the fact that truth ought to be subordinate to life, that truth is just a kind of error that is indispensable for life, versus the idea that life could be a means to knowledge being true belief. So the idea of knowledge is dependent on the notion of truth. Well, aside from pointing out yet again that this is not a systematic philosophy, and so it's not going to perfectly cohere, I think it's as simple as saying that it is the will to truth that leads Nietzsche to critique the will to truth, to question the value of truth. That it is the pursuit of truth that leads him to the question of value, and that what he really does with truth is to incorporate value into it. He incorporates value into the definition of truth. He inquires about the value of truth and the truth of values. They're interrelated concepts, which means that truths which undermine the ability to value are not really truths at all. And similarly, we might say that values that cannot be truly realized in the world, we might say are disconnected from reality. They're not true values in that sense. And, it seems the most natural thing in the world to be able to rank order the value of truths in order to make evaluations about the value of truths that we hold, independent from this objectivity standard that has nothing to do with, that tries to separate the idea of value from our truth claims, right? Because value, meaning goal, what we desire, what we want, what we seek, science tries to separate that out, tries to distill objective facts away out of, tries to purify them so that they don't have any of that all too human gunk in them. But that's what Nietzsche says is precisely we can't separate. And this dovetails into the idea that the will to truth is actually a form of the will to power, which is very important. Heidegger will say that the will to power also implies the will to truth, that they're kind of two sides of the same coin as well. But that's how I would reconcile this. Life is a means to knowledge, and so Nietzsche does live his life in pursuit of knowledge, and that pursuit of knowledge causes him to turn about and critique the entire pursuit of knowledge. But in a way, in order to be a more, what might we say, devout seeker of knowledge than anyone ever has been before him. And I think that's often how Nietzsche, ironically, presents himself. And so I love in Media Vita, I love its implications for Nietzsche's broader philosophy. I love how it throws for a loop the whole notion that truth ought to serve life. And it's also, again, a wonderful confession, a statement of Nietzsche's his tonality of the soul at this time in the gay science. So let's go to 325, quote, "What belongs to greatness? Who will attain anything great if he does not find in himself the strength and the will to inflict great suffering? Being able to suffer is the least thing. Weak women and even slaves often achieve virtuosity in that. But not to perish of internal distress and uncertainty when one inflicts great suffering, and here's the cry of this suffering. That is great. That belongs to greatness." End quote. Now, obviously there's the surface level reading of this aphorism, but it's very interesting to consider it. Consider the implications insofar as, okay, think about a person of the master morality, the naive, innocent barbarian. Presumably, at least the way Nietzsche portrays them, they would not feel internal distress and uncertainty as they inflict great suffering and hear the cry of that suffering, right? So Nietzsche's presenting this as like a thing that we have to overcome. But it seems that this thing that we have to overcome is already the slave morality, which means that you're a product of the slave morality, at least to some extent, if you have to overcome this. So even having to overcome it, having to display, Nietzsche might describe this as a kind of asceticism of the strong. In fact, in one of his unpublished notes in The Will to Power, he explicitly calls it that. He says the asceticism demanded of the strong is to be able to endure atrocities and to commit atrocities. And we might say, using the language of this passage, to endure committing them. But why would that require asceticism? When Nietzsche, I believe it's in the Greek State, where he speaks of Alexander having Battus, basically his ankles pierced through and then having him dragged throughout the city, this man who nobly defended his position. And then Alexander shows this horrific, as Nietzsche calls it, again, tiger-like cruelty towards him. He says this allows us to look into the abysses of hatred that were experienced by people in earlier times, abysses of hatred that were in no way mediated or moderated by our modern-day slave morality religions. He doesn't use that terminology at this time because he hadn't come up with the master and slave morality yet, but he already very much had a concept of how Christianity had fundamentally altered the way that we look at all of these things, and that he already had a concept that the Greek had a very different orientation toward the world, and that it's a mistake to think he would experience the same guilt that we do for the same things we would. And so I just think it's very telling that Nietzsche phrases this in terms of, having to overcome internal distress, which is something that a master morality person would not even experience. So if you have that internal distress, it's like you have to, again, bring a kind of ascetic discipline to overcome it in order to do what? Inflict suffering, right? That sort of internal critique of mine aside, what Nietzsche's saying here is that being able to suffer is the least thing. Weak women and even slaves often achieve virtuosity in that. That's very obviously a dig at Christianity. Also, you can see it in Buddhism. One of the virtues at least in Mahayana Buddhism, is forbearance. It's the ability to endure suffering, basically. So, like Huike, the second patriarch of Zen, was said to be a master of forbearance. And I remember I was discussing this with another friend of mine who was interested in Zen at the time, and we had very philosophical and idiosyncratic and orthodox approaches. Agreed on some things, disagreed on others, but we would have these conversations. And I remember he asked me, he was like, what does it mean that he's a master of forbearance? And I said, basically it means he bears suffering very well. And he said, wow, what a what a horrible compliment to give some, like what a put down, right? It's like you have nothing else going for you, but you sure bear suffering well. I just thought that was hilarious at the time. But it's funny because that's the irony of Buddhism in general. Is it's like, how do we deal with the problem of life, which is the problem of suffering, right? The problem of thirsting and dissatisfactoriness and pain and all of these things. And so, I mean, to get to the point, the virtue of being able to bear up under pain is a slave morality virtue. You could argue they even do it better than the master morality. And so, again, even in this passage in The Gay Science, Nietzsche hasn't come up with these ideas yet, but he's kind of saying, is this really like a good virtue? Is that really enough? You have to be willing to inflict some suffering and overcome the slave morality that's already within you in order to do that, which is ironic because it would almost require a form of asceticism. But he says that's what belongs to greatness. And I think, here, I think somebody like Kaufman would try and look at this from like a personal or existential lens. I remember him talking about how in analyzing Nietzsche's work, like Goethe didn't want to break Friederike's heart. He fell in love with her, and then he was like, I'm not marrying you. And then she fell madly in love with him, but he left her, and she had never really recovered from that. It kind of ruined her life, that this great man fell in love with her and caused her to fall in love with him, seduced her in a way. This sophisticated artist, city guy goes, seduces the country girl, and then just leaves her in shambles. But that wasn't because he had any malice towards her, right? But we might say from like a Sartrean like attempt at achieving good faith, right? That occasionally you have to make those choices where you hurt other people, and you're going to have to overcome the pain of causing them distress in order to live authentically. That might be like a Kaufmanite existential reading. If we consider this, though, in the light of the sort of idea of like experimentation with morality, or even with man as the material, the experimental material, I can imagine a situation, or many types of situations, in which you might have a choice as, say, a world leader, or as, maybe a tech giant, or any number of types of people, where you have the opportunity to either play it safe or risk, perhaps, human lives, life and limb, of not just yourself, but perhaps other people, in order to achieve a scientific breakthrough, or a new like political order, or to colonize another planet, we might say, right? Or experiment in the human physiology. There are all of these things that could be, and we could imagine rather ghoulish and exploitative forms of this, but there might also be like a genuine situation in which like you need to make like that experimental sacrifice, or at least risk the possibility that people will be harmed in the search for knowledge, or in the quest to advance the species, something like that. And to be able to overcome the Christian values that have been beaten into us, inculcated into us, in order to make a decision like that. I think that is what Nietzsche's getting at. At least there's an element of that. And importantly, what should be clear in the fact that he thinks we should overcome internal distress is that he doesn't think this will be something you take joy in, or that you're doing it because you're malicious or sadistic. It's almost like as a modern humane person, a moral person, you're going to have to overcome all that in order to make like leaps forward. And like, honestly, communist regimes and their attempts at like Mao's great leap forward in the Cultural Revolution, you can see those as like experiments in social planning, social engineering, and trying to do what? To bring forward like utopia on Earth, and being willing to sacrifice potentially millions of lives in the name of that political and social experiment. Now, would Mao have necessarily seen it in those terms? Probably not. Would most Nietzscheans agree that a communist utopia is a good goal to aim at? Probably not. But I think that gets close to the spirit of the thing, of like, it's just so funny how so many people say communism failed, we just shouldn't think about it anymore. It's like, I do look at many things that were tried in the 20th century as experiments that, I don't think we need to keep retrying the old experiments of the past over and over again. That is also stupid. But, I just don't have the same, I don't know. Like, I guess I would feel differently if I had friends and family who were, killed in the Great Leap Forward or something like that, or the Holodomor or something. But I think it gets to the spirit of what Nietzsche's talking about. Being willing to morally compromise yourself in the name of some dream, some crazy dream, some crazy new thing that hasn't been seen on the earth before. And, we can think about that what we will, whether that would be, whether that's a laudable thing for Nietzsche to advocate or not. But I think we should be completionists or about our reading of Nietzsche insofar as we should take in the complete Nietzsche and not try and shy away from any of it. And even though you can interpret it multiple ways, it's always important to me to look at the aspects of Nietzsche that make modern people with their modern morality kind of cringe a little bit. It's like he's saying human life can be experimental material in the hands of some, mad scientist or political, strongman or something. That's just what we should just regard that as an experiment for the destiny of the human race. And we should actually encourage those people to overcome their moral qualms so that they can do these things. Doesn't that justify Pol Pot, and doesn't that justify Elon Musk putting Neuralink into people's brains and transforming them into our army of killer cyber? People can come up with all sorts of things. People have been freaking out about Nietzsche's philosophy for the better part of a century and talking about all the bad things it could lead to. But I don't know. It's take it for what you will. I'm not here to give you my moral opinion. I'm here to try and best explain how I think Nietzsche thought about that. And I think this passage does have those elements. It's especially clear from his notes that the nature of Nietzsche's, the kinds of experiments he hopes will be done, the scope is very broad. All right, let's go to 326. Quote, "The physicians of the soul and pain. All preachers of morals, as well as all theologians, share one bad habit. All of them try to con men into believing that they are in a very bad way and need some ultimate hard, radical cure. Because humanity has listened to these teachers much too eagerly for whole centuries, something of this superstition that they are in a very bad way has finally stuck. Now they are only too ready to sigh, to find nothing good in life, and to sulk together as if life were really hard to endure. Actually, they are overwhelmingly sure of their life and in love with it, and they know innumerable ruses and subtle tricks to vanquish what is disagreeable and pull the fangs of pain and misfortune." End quote. This passage goes on, but I just wanted to say, once again, Nietzsche is returning to that same point from the beginning of the book, that even the people who say there's something fundamentally wrong with life are in some way seducing us to life. That actually, as he says here, they're overwhelmingly sure of life and in love with it. And how is it? Well, it's because they're saying there's something to life, there's something behind life. Beware. There's something to do here, there's something important about life. And it's a way even a negative valuation of life, where what you have to do is to reject and transcend your attachment to life, is still something important to do in life, which makes life a valuable thing. It's why the human existence in Buddhism is a valuable thing. It's why having a soul in Christianity and being created in the image of God is a very valuable thing. But we've already sort of brought up the passage in the genealogy where the priest says, "My suffering sheep, I know why you're suffering, and you yourself are the cause." Nietzsche is sort of, this is a variation on that same thing here. All right, so let's finish out the passage. Quote, "It seems to me that people always exaggerate when they speak of pain and misfortune, as if it were a requirement of good manners to exaggerate here, while one keeps studiously quiet about the fact that there are innumerable palliatives against pain, such as anesthesia, or the feverish haste of thoughts, or a quiet posture, or good or bad memories, purposes, hopes, and many kinds of pride and sympathy that almost have the same effect as anesthetics. And at the highest degrees of pain, one automatically loses consciousness. We know quite well how to drip sweetnesses upon our bitternesses, especially the bitternesses of the soul. We find remedies in our courage and sublimity, as well as the nobler deliria of submission and resignation. A loss is a loss for barely 1 hour. Somehow it always brings us some gift from heaven. New strength, for example, or at least a new opportunity for strength. What fantasies about the inner misery of evil people moral preachers have invented. What lies they have told us about the unhappiness of passionate people. Lies is really the proper word here, for they knew very well of the overrich happiness of this kind of human being, but they kept a deadly silence about it because it refuted their theory, according to which all happiness begins only after the annihilation of passion and the silencing of the will. Finally, regarding the prescription of all those physicians of the soul and their praise of a hard radical cure, it should be permitted to ask, is our life really painful and burdensome enough to make it advantageous to exchange it for a stoic way of life and petrification? We are not so badly off that we have to be as badly off as Stoics. End quote. So as Nietzsche makes it clear at the end there, as I brought up in that passage on the Stoics and Epicureans, there are many things that you might say that about the Stoics that might make you think that Nietzsche would admire them more than the Epicureans, because the Epicureans have a hedonistic view of existence, a consequentialist utilitarian view, if you will, of existence. They're negative hedonists trying to reduce pain, trying to curtail their existence to be in the most comfort as possible. And the Stoics, meanwhile, make themselves hard and tough and unattached, detached from the outcomes, the consequences, from pleasure or pain, so that they can deal with anything. They can survive. They can even flourish in any circumstance. But in fact, as we know, Nietzsche was rather negative about the Stoics and actually somewhat positive about the Epicureans, if not without his criticism. And I think it's clear here why that is, because the Stoic way of life is a kind of petrification. It's a way of deadening one's feeling of pleasure and pain. It's why he compares them to that Arabian sect of the Asayua, who swallow scorpions in glass shards as a public display of what they can endure. Well, somebody who can do that, who can endure to swallow, it's clearly a metaphor for dealing with the most painful experiences, whether that be physiological or psychological. Well, what does Nietzsche say about deadening pain? You would also deaden pleasure. And that, throughout these aphorisms about the wisdom of pain, what would Nietzsche think of all that? He doesn't necessarily think that's a good idea, to live in such a way that nothing hurts you because you can endure anything. Now, of course, is this an actual fair representation of Stoicism? Not really. It's a caricature, but for the purposes of making a point. Because the sudden radical cure offered by the priests and the philosophical priests of all ages, obviously when Nietzsche says the annihilation of passion and the silencing of the will, very clearly invoking Schopenhauer there. Because after all, Schopenhauer also believes in a sort of a negative form of happiness as the absence of suffering, and therefore thinks the best thing to do is to, just that, annihilate passion, silence the will, use the will to negate itself. That is the path to happiness, to whatever extent we can actually achieve it. And Nietzsche's asking, it's kind of a cheeky question, but he's got a good point. Is life really so painful that we need this radical cure? Do we need to become Christians or Buddhists or Stoics or adopt some complete life-changing philosophy in order to cope with the suffering of life? Is that really needed? Maybe it would be needed if you're, maybe if you're in a foxhole somewhere, or maybe if you're actually being tortured, or maybe if you're incarcerated for 20 years, or all these sorts of circumstances we might imagine where you'll really need Stoicism. And so, the Stoical argument would be you've got to build up the skill in case you should ever find yourself in that position. But Nietzsche would say that in most of the troubles that we experience, the bad moods, the catastrophes, our failures, our depressions, lost loves, and times when we haven't achieved what we wanted, or where we were rejected, or any number of these things, he says there's all sorts of palliatives for dealing with these low feelings. He says feverish haste and thoughts, quiet posture, good or bad memories, purposes, hopes, and many kinds of pride and sympathy. It's interesting the way that Nietzsche always gives these long lists, because like in Media Vita, a couple aphorisms before, he says, let knowledge be whatever it is for other people, a bed to rest on, or the way to such a bed, or a diversion, or a form of leisure. It's like Nietzsche's always aware of how the mind, or it's not really the mind, a drive or an impulse can seize upon any number of things. Like all of those different uses of knowledge within life could represent any number of different impulses. And whichever one that somebody adopts is going to reveal something about the cocktail of impulses that is, that combusts within them or something like that. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is like Nietzsche's view is pluralistic in this sense as well, that he's always seeing that there are so many possibilities for what our thoughts or our drives can seize on to use as, what is going to be the meaning of knowledge. For this person, it's this. For that person, it's another thing. For this person, it's a third thing. And here he says, what are the kinds of cures we can use for our sadness? We can use this, we could use X, Y, or Z, or, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's an infinite number of things almost. There's this vast variety and diversity of the human species. And that, I just appreciate it because he often stops himself where other philosophers would begin to expound a generality, make universal, sweeping, broad generalizations about the human race. And Nietzsche often stops to say, well, it could be all of these different things. It's never predetermined all of the different ways that we're able to deal with our depressions. But what he's pointing out is most of us, or many people, do have their way. And that it is surprising, again, as we were talking about sort of like the way that feelings present themselves to us in our minds, or like in our experience as an ethos rather than a pathos, the state of mind can present itself as if it's, this enduring truth of the world when it's really not. Because it's so easy, actually, to sort of alchemically turn that around, turn lead into gold. And it is true at even some of the hardest times in my life. It's not like every single moment you're walking around absolutely depressed and sick with sadness or worry or anxiety or whatever. Even within a time period in my life in which I was very depressed, still from day to day have minutes or hours or even whole days where you have pretty much high, good feelings or normal, well-adjusted feelings, right? We're way more multifarious and inconsistent and discontinuous than we like to admit. And there are all sorts of ways and tricks with ourselves. And so it's just funny because this radical hard cure just strikes me as something that you would come up with if you do think people are coherent, consistent, stable, enduring things, rather than a confluence of drives or events or patterns or movements or something like that. Again, a series of discontinuous states that really could be quite chaotic and quite inconsistent. You would think, it would be like this total personality change idea brought on by religious conversion or adoption of a new philosophy. It sort of hinges on this idea of the consistency of your personality. Before that, changing into a completely new one that will then be consistent after that, after you're born again or whatever the case may be. But if we, how would we put it, give in to the chaos within, if we are honest and sober and looking at ourselves as a kind of chaos, we won't need these radical cures because we'll see how our drives are capable of doing alchemy with ourselves and transforming ourselves in all of these little ways on a day-to-day basis. And the last note is something that Nietzsche will bring up again in Beyond Good and Evil. The moralists always ignore the type of evil man who is happy. And I've kind of touched on this earlier in this very episode. But he says it's a species the moralists are always silent about in Beyond Good and Evil. Here he's much harsher. He says, these are lies. Lies are the proper word. They know very well of the overrich happiness of this type of human being. Now, I'm not sure how Nietzsche thinks he knows that they know this, but I mean, at least here it's much more aggressive language, that the priest is lying to you. He knows that the evil person can be happy, the passionate person can be happy. He just weaves a story about how that always, at least ends in ruin and unhappiness. So many morality tales are like that, especially like old golden age of cinema, American films, downfalls of people who, like Citizen Kane, classic example, right? Although that's a far more complex film than that. Okay, let's do one more aphorism for this week, and that is 327. Quote, taking seriously. In the great majority, the intellect is a clumsy, gloomy, creaking machine that is difficult to start. They call it taking the matter seriously when they want to work with this machine and think well. How burdensome they must find good thinking. The lovely human breast always seems to lose its good spirits when it thinks well. It becomes serious. And where laughter and gaiety are found, thinking does not amount to anything. That is the prejudice of this serious beast against all gay science. Well then, let us prove that this is a prejudice, end quote. And I don't have much to say on this one. I think it's a perfect ending note because it's the mission statement of the gay science. And we've already explained it way back in the first episode, that the implications, the connotations of what science is, Nietzsche attempts to reverse this in the gay science. And he states it as straightforwardly as possible, that they think of the thought as like this old creaky machine that they have to start up. It's this like sort of tedious, like plodding, boring process, and an industrial process of some kind, a mechanistic process of some kind, and above all, it's solemn and serious. And Nietzsche's gay science is exactly the opposite. And laughter and gaiety, rather than spoiling the act of thinking, are in fact required ingredients of it. As he says in his notes that, the typical religious formulation is that you have to believe something and then you can become, exuberant. You hear the good news and then you live a life of exuberance. Whereas Nietzsche says it should really be the opposite. Those who are exuberant, those are the beliefs that come from those types of souls. Those are the ones that you should trust. It's actually a prerequisite towards thinking, is the ability for gaiety and high elevated states of the soul. That we should not try to divorce or distill out the logical from the aspect of value or desiring or all of that subjective human gunk. That should be a part of science. And that it's not this plodding, industrious machine. It's a chaotic, multifarious process to think. It's, again, guided by impulses. Its thought is always seized on by impulses. And above all, it's not a solemn and serious matter, for reasons we've discussed throughout. So that will be all for this episode. The final episode of the Gay Science Book 4, our read-through, is coming up next. After that, we're not going to return to this book for quite some time until after season 6, we'll hit book 5, which, again, as I've said, I think is fitting because book 5 was not composed until several years later. So it's just fine to wait a little while. But I'm very happy that we got to cover In Media Vita and that we're going to hit some of the most important aphorisms of Nietzsche's whole canon next week. Which I've already had whole episodes dedicated to them, so we'll see how much detail I really go into in the walkthrough. But I'll try and give you the best analysis in context with the rest of the book that I can. So, all right, thank you for joining me, everyone. Very excited to wrap this one up and get into season 6 and all the material there. Cheers, and signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.